The air in the main hangar at Fort Davidson, a remote and largely forgotten military installation baking under the relentless Texas sun, was thick with the scent of jet fuel, hydraulic fluid, and the faint metallic temps of boredom. It was a place of routine, of monotonous maintenance schedules and the slow, grinding passage of time. A purgatory for soldiers who were either too new to matter or too seasoned to be on the front lines anymore. Humvees and transport planes sat in silent, orderly rows under the cavernous ceiling, their engines cold, their purpose dormant. This was the quiet, unglamorous heart of the military machine, the place where the gears were greased and the weapons were cleaned far from the eyes of the world into this world of predictable order. Lieutenant Christina Santos had arrived 3 weeks earlier like a ghost. She was quiet, efficient, and, by all outward appearances, utterly unremarkable. As the new maintenance officer, her job was to oversee the endless checklists and supply requisitions that kept the base's hardware in a state of perpetual readiness. She moved through the hangar with an economy of motion that was almost unnerving, her footsteps silent on the oil-stained concrete, her presence so unobtrusive that she seemed to blend into the shadows between the massive vehicles. She was, by all accounts, just another officer doing her job, distinguished only by the chaotic latticework of scars that snaked up her forearms, a brutal roadmap of a past she never, ever spoke of. She had chosen Fort Davidson for its obscurity. She had chosen it for its silence, for its distance from the polished corridors of the Pentagon, from the prying eyes of Washington, from the suffocating weight of a reputation she had spent the last 2 years desperately trying to escape. After Operation Black Storm, a mission so deeply classified that its very existence was a rumor whispered only in the most secure, soundproofed rooms of the intelligence community, she needed invisibility. She needed to be just another cog in the machine, a place where she could heal the wounds that no one could see, far from the medals that haunted her dreams and the fame that felt like a shroud. But invisibility, she was quickly learning, was a luxury not afforded to a black woman in a position of authority, no matter how minor, especially not when Private Ramos was around. Ramos was 19 years old, fresh out of basic training, and he carried his privilege like a second uniform. The son of a retired, well-connected colonel, he had grown up in the insular, self-reverential world of military aristocracy. He believed the army was his birthright, a private playground where he could play at being a soldier without ever having to endure the sacrifice or discipline that the uniform demanded. And from the moment he laid eyes on Lieutenant Santos, he had found his new favorite toy. In his youthful, arrogant ignorance, he saw her not as a superior officer, but as an anomaly, a glitch in the system. A black woman in a technical role, her position, he concluded with the unshakable certainty of the truly stupid, could only be the result of affirmative action, a box-ticking exercise in diversity. Her quiet competence he mistook for weakness, her professional distance for fear, and her scars. They were a source of endless, cruel amusement. "Look who's here to ruin our day," he would announce with a loud braying laugh every morning when Christina entered the hangar for the daily briefing. "The vet is going to teach us about maintenance today. I hope she doesn't cut herself on the tools." His small clique of equally inexperienced, equally insecure recruits would snicker along with him. The seasoned veterans on the base, men who had seen real combat, reacted differently. Corporal Martinez, a quiet, watchful man who had done 2 tours in Afghanistan, would always try to change the subject, his attempts at diversion a subtle but clear sign of his disapproval. Sergeant Major Jackson, a mountain of a man who had served on 3 continents and whose face was a roadmap of battles both won and lost, would simply shake his head, a look of profound, weary disgust in his eyes, and walk away. "You guys are too sensitive," Ramos would tease after they had gone. "She's just a maintenance officer. She probably got the job because they needed to fill their quotas. Look at her. I bet she's never even seen a real firefight." What Ramos, in his blindness, failed to see were the signs that any experienced soldier would have recognized immediately. The way Christina always positioned herself in a room, her back to a solid wall, her eyes commanding a complete panoramic view of her the way her gaze was never still, constantly making unconscious tactical sweeps, assessing entry points, exit routes, potential threats. The way she moved, with a fluid, predatory grace, an economy of gesture that spoke of years of training in the deadly art of silent killing. During the second week Ramos's campaign of petty tyranny escalated. He began to accidentally bump into her in the crowded hallways, always with a loud, sarcastic apology. "Whoa, watch out there, Lieutenant. Wouldn't want you to get hurt." His friends had stopped laughing by then. Even the newest recruits, boys as young and as green as Ramos, had begun to feel the cold, uncomfortable weight of his cruelty. "Lieutenant Scars," he called out one afternoon, his voice loud enough for half the hangar to hear as she was inspecting a row of rifles. "Maybe you should wear long gloves. You're scaring the rookies with those marks on your arms." Christina stopped her inspection. She placed a rifle back on the rack with a soft, deliberate click. She turned, slowly, and looked directly at him. For 5 long seconds, an eternity in the charged air of the hangar, she did not speak. She simply studied him. It was not a look of anger. It was something far more disturbing. It was the look of a predator assessing its prey, a calm, clinical, and utterly detached analysis. Ramos, for the first time, felt a genuine, unwelcome shiver of fear. He swallowed, his throat suddenly dry. "Private," she said finally, her voice low, but carrying an authority that seemed utterly disproportionate to her rank. "Some scars tell stories you wouldn't want to hear in your worst nightmares." She turned and walked away, leaving him standing there with a strange, sick feeling in the pit of his stomach. But his immaturity, his deep-seated need to be the dominant male in any room, quickly overrode his fear. He interpreted her calm response not as a warning, but as weakness. If she had yelled, if she had reported him to his superiors, he would have understood that. He would have respected the power play. But her quiet, dignified dismissal, he saw it as proof that she was afraid of him, that she wouldn't fight back. And that is when he made his fatal mistake. On the Friday of the 3rd week, during the morning briefing for all hangar personnel, Colonel Henderson, the base's affable but technically out-of-his-depth commander, was discussing a new weapons system. He made a small, technical error in his description of the rifle's gas piston system. Discreetly, respectfully, Christina corrected him. "Sir, with all due respect, the cycling rate on that model is actually 750 rounds per minute, not 900. It's a common misconception." Henderson, a good man who was smart enough to know what he didn't know, thanked her for the correction. But Ramos, sitting in the back with his cronies, couldn't contain himself. He whispered, but he whispered with the deliberate volume of a man who wants to be overheard. "Of course she knows about weapons. She probably cut herself playing with one at the academy." The silence that descended upon the briefing room was absolute. It was a heavy, suffocating blanket of disbelief. Every veteran in that room, from the grizzled sergeants to the young corporals, turned to look at him with an expression of pure, unadulterated horror. Sergeant Major Jackson, who was standing near the front, clenched his fists so tightly that his knuckles turned a bloodless white. He looked as if he were about to physically launch himself across the room. Everyone knew Christina had heard it. The insult was too loud, too public, to be missed. But she did not react. She did not turn around. She did not acknowledge the comment in any way. She simply continued taking notes in her small government issue notebook, her handwriting a model of perfect, steady script. In that moment, Private Ramos, in his infinite, arrogant ignorance, sealed his own fate, because what he, and everyone else in that room, interpreted as submission, as the quiet acceptance of a final, crushing humiliation, was something else entirely. It was the strategic patience of a master hunter who had just watched her prey, fat and stupid and drunk on its own sense of superiority, walk directly into the kill zone of a perfectly laid ambush. What Ramos didn't know was that his every move, his every word, his every pathetic attempt to assert his dominance, was being meticulously documented by eyes far more experienced and far more dangerous than his own. Sergeant Major Jackson had recognized Christina on her first day, not her face, which he had never seen, but her essence, the way she moved, the way she observed, the almost supernatural stillness she possessed. "There's something wrong with that, Lieutenant," Jackson had commented discreetly to Corporal Martinez in the 2nd week. "Very wrong. Did you see how she field stripped and reassembled that M4 rifle during the weapons inspection yesterday? 17 seconds, blindfolded. What kind of maintenance officer does that?" Martinez, whose life had been saved on an unofficial mission in Syria 3 years earlier by a shadowy, almost mythical operator known only as Sombra, had simply shaken his head. "I tried to warn the kid, Top," he had said, "but he thinks he knows everything." In fact, Jackson had already sent a series of discreet, encrypted emails to some old contacts at the Pentagon, asking careful coded questions about recently transferred officers with a specific highly skill set. The responses he had received were a masterclass in official evasion. The kind of bureaucratic vagueness that only exists when something is so highly classified that even acknowledging its existence is a breach of national security. Christina, for her part, maintained her routine of calculated invisibility. During the day, she was the perfect maintenance officer, quiet, competent, and utterly forgettable. But in the dead of night, when the base was asleep, she was someone else entirely. In her Spartan, anonymous room, she would sit in the dark, her fingers flying across the keyboard of an encrypted laptop that officially did not exist. She conducted a thorough, ongoing tactical analysis of her environment, mapping security, camera, blind spots, access points, and the routines of the night guards. It was not paranoia. It was instinct, an instinct honed by 7 years of operating deep in hostile territory, where a single, overlooked detail could mean the difference between life and death. And Private Ramos, with his escalating arrogance and his powerful family backing, represented exactly the kind of unpredictable, internal threat she had been trained to identify, assess, and, if necessary, neutralize. The hand-to-hand combat incident was the point of no return. It was a mandatory training exercise for all personnel. Ramos, his ego still smarting from being publicly corrected, saw his chance for revenge. He deliberately chose Christina as his sparring partner, loudly proclaiming that someone needed to teach the lieutenant some basic self-defense techniques. "Take it easy, Lieutenant Scars," he taunted, as they stepped onto the mat, his voice echoing in the gymnasium. "We wouldn't want you to get hurt again." What happened in the next 3 minutes left 60 soldiers in a state of absolute, stunned silence. Christina didn't just defend herself, she dismantled him. She moved with a fluid, brutal efficiency that was terrifying to behold. Every one of Ramos's clumsy, telegraphed attacks was countered with a move that was faster, cleaner, and infinitely more sophisticated. When he lunged for an arm lock he had learned in basic training, she flowed with his momentum, using it against him, and in a blur of motion that most of the soldiers couldn't even follow, she had him on the ground, pinned, his arm twisted, to a point just shy of breaking, his face pressed into the mat. "Nice technique, soldier," she said, her voice calm, her breathing even. She released him and offered a hand to help him up. "But you telegraphed the move with your left shoulder." In a real combat situation, that hesitation would have been fatal. Ramos scrambled to his feet, his face a mask of pure, unadulterated hatred. His ego was not just bruised, it had been shattered. But instead of learning from the experience, his humiliation only fueled his rage. He began spreading rumors that she had used dirty street tricks, that she had cheated, that she had fought unfairly. It was then that Christina made a decision. The educational phase of the operation was over. It was time to prepare for the final engagement. She began to systematically compile her own evidence, documenting every racist comment, every disrespectful gesture, every moment he had abused his position to humiliate her. But she was not alone. Corporal Martinez, who was now certain he knew her true identity, finally approached her. He found her in the equipment storage room, late one night, calibrating the sights on a sniper rifle with a jeweler's precision. "Lieutenant," he said, his voice low, "I can't confirm this, and you can't confirm this, but if you are who I think you are, well, some of us have been documenting Private Ramos's behavior, just in case you need it." Christina studied him for a long, silent moment. "I don't know what you're talking about, Corporal," she said, her voice flat. "Of course you don't, ma'am." Martinez smiled, a flash of profound, unwavering loyalty in his eyes. "But if you did, you'd also know that that kid is digging his own grave. And when it's deep enough," he paused, "well, let's just say that some very important people are going to want to know exactly how a soldier with his disciplinary record managed to spend an entire month humiliating a decorated field-grade officer with absolutely no consequences." From that day on, a silent, invisible network of veterans began to operate on the base. Sergeant Williams discreetly pulled Ramos's communication logs. Discovering that he had been bragging about putting the affirmative action lieutenant in her place in message groups with his friends back home, Sergeant Major Jackson began to coincidentally show up whenever Ramos started his taunts, jotting down dates, times, and direct quotes in a small black notebook. And Christina remained the perfect target, calm, professional, seemingly defenseless. But in the dead of night, she typed her final, detailed report on her encrypted laptop. Each incident was documented with the cold, precise, and irrefutable clarity of a military after-action report. What none of them knew, not even Jackson or Martinez, was that Christina's transfer to Fort Davidson had not been random. General Maxwell, her former commander and one of the few men on the planet who knew her true story, had personally engineered it. After the bloody, brutal success of Operation Blackstorm, he knew she needed a place to decompress, a place where she could be a ghost and heal. But he had also left very specific, standing orders with the base command. Any and all irregularities involving Lieutenant Christina Santos were to be reported directly, and immediately, to his personal office. The night before the general's scheduled inspection, an inspection that Ramos and the rest of the base believed to be a routine surprise visit, Christina received an encrypted message on her personal tablet. It was from Jackson tomorrow, 0830. Hangar C surprise inspection, General Maxwell. Get ready. She looked out the window of her small Spartan room at the lights of the base, spread out like a constellation in the vast Texas darkness. In less than 12 hours, the arrogant young man who had spent a month trying to break her would finally find out exactly who he had been messing with. But something in her gaze, a deep, weary sadness, suggested that the revelation would only be the beginning, not the end, of what was to come. Because when you have spent years learning that survival depends on strategic patience, you don't reveal your hand until you are absolutely certain that the game has been won. And while Private Ramos slept peacefully, dreaming the arrogant dreams of the privileged, Colonel Christina Santos put the finishing touches on a report that would not only destroy his career, but would serve as a chilling case study on how prejudice and privilege can create fatal blind spots in the next generation of military leaders. The storm was not just about personal justice, it was about sending a message, and that message was about to be delivered with the full, overwhelming force of the United States Army. The morning air in Hangar C was thick with a nervous, electric tension. At 0830 sharp, the hangar doors rumbled open, and General Maxwell entered. He was a man who seemed to carry his own weather system, a four-star general whose reputation preceded him like a thunderclap. Decades of command had hardened his face into a mask of authority, and his presence alone was enough to make the 600 soldiers in the hangar snap to a state of perfect, rigid attention. All except one, Private Ramos, still basking in the glow of his perceived victory in the gymnasium, was whispering a final, crude joke about Lieutenant Scars to his friend when the unthinkable happened. General Maxwell, who was striding down the center aisle, stopped abruptly. His gaze, sharp enough to cut glass, had locked onto the maintenance officer standing at the back of the formation. The general's face, a stony landscape carved by decades of command, transformed. The hardness melted away, replaced by an expression of pure, unadulterated shock, which then morphed into something else entirely, reverence. "My God," Maxwell breathed, his voice a low rumble of disbelief that echoed in the deathly silence of the hangar shadow. "Is that really you?" The name hung in the air, a word of impossible weight and meaning. Ramos felt the blood drain from his face, a cold, sickening tide of dread pulling him under. Shadow. The name meant only one thing in the hushed, legendary circles of the military. It was a ghost story, a myth, the call sign of the most lethal, most decorated, and most anonymous operator in modern American military history. The woman who had single-handedly rescued 17 diplomatic hostages from a fortified compound in Yemen. The ghost who had infiltrated enemy bases alone and emerged with intelligence that had altered the course of entire conflicts. And then, in a scene that shattered every known protocol of military hierarchy, General Marcus Maxwell, the most feared and respected general in the entire United States Army, turned to face Lieutenant Christina Santos, the woman Ramos had spent a month tormenting, and rendered a salute. It was not the perfunctory gesture of a superior to a subordinate. It was a salute of profound, soul-deep respect, the salute of one warrior acknowledging another. "Colonel Santos," the general said, his voice now heavy with a genuine, undisguised admiration. "It is an honor to have you back, even under these circumstances." "Colonel," the word was a gunshot in the silent hangar. Ramos felt his knees buckle. Colonel, not lieutenant. He had spent 3 weeks publicly, gleefully, humiliating an officer who outranked his own father, an officer whose real name was a state secret, whose real story was the stuff of legend. "Sir," Christina replied, her voice as calm and steady as ever, though a flicker of something regret perhaps passed through her eyes. "I apologize for the breach of protocol. My identity was supposed to remain classified." "Nonsense," the general boomed, his gaze sweeping across the stunned faces of the soldiers. "Everyone," he roared, his voice cutting through the air like a knife. "You have had the profound privilege of working alongside a living legend. This is Colonel Christina Santos, architect of Operation Black." recipient of the Distinguished Service Cross, the Silver Star, and the Legion of Merit. Responsible for missions that some of you have only heard whispered about in the darkest corners of the Pentagon. A murmur of pure, unadulterated awe rippled through the ranks. The seasoned veterans, men like Jackson and Martinez, looked at each other, a silent, profound understanding passing between them. The fragmented stories, the rumors, the myths, they were all true. And she had been here, among them, all along. Ramos was paralyzed, his mind a screaming void of terror and disbelief. Every joke, every racist comment, every gesture of contempt, now replayed in his memory, each one a nail in the coffin of his own career. He had mocked the scars of a woman who had earned them saving lives. He had questioned the competence of an officer whose achievements would make his own colonel father look like a Boy Scout. Sergeant Major Jackson, the general called Dot Jackson, stepped forward, carrying a thick, bulging folder. As requested, sir, the complete documentation from the last 30 days. The general opened the folder. His expression, which had been one of reverence, slowly hardened into a mask of cold, controlled fury as he read pages and pages of detailed reports. Every comment Ramos had made, every public humiliation, every gesture of disrespect, meticulously documented with dates, times, and witnesses. There were discrete photos of the harassment. There were transcripts of recorded conversations, revealing racist comments Ramos had thought were private jokes among friends. Private Ramos, the general's voice, was now as cold and as hard as a block of ice. Step forward. With legs that felt like they were made of lead, Ramos stumbled forward. Each step was a funeral drum, echoing in the vast, silent hangar. 600 pairs of eyes watched him, their expressions a mixture of horror, contempt, and a kind of grim, vengeful satisfaction. Over the past 3 weeks, Private, the general began, his voice dangerously quiet. You have systematically harassed, humiliated, and shown profound racial disrespect toward a superior officer. An officer, he paused, his eyes narrowing, who could break you into 12 pieces before you even realized what was happening. Sir, I didn't know, Ramos stammered, his voice a pathetic, breaking whimper. Exactly, the general thundered, his voice suddenly exploding with a fury that made Ramos physically flinch. You didn't know. And do you know why you didn't know? Because your arrogance, your privilege, and your lazy, inherited prejudice have created blind spots so vast that you have become incapable of recognizing excellence when it is standing right in front of you. Christina remained silent, her face a mask of professional calm. There was no triumph in her gaze, only the quiet, weary satisfaction of seeing a necessary, if unpleasant, duty performed. Corporal Martinez, the general called. Read aloud section 17 of the report. Martinez stepped forward, his face grim. He opened the document. On the Friday of the 3rd week, he read, his voice clear and steady. Private Ramos publicly referred to Colonel Santos as a vet, suggesting that her combat scars were the result of domestic accidents. When informed by veterans to moderate his behavior, he responded, and I quote, "She's just a maintenance officer who got her position through racial quotas." A deadly final silence fell over the hangar. Racist comments were an absolute red line. In the modern army, Ramos had not just crossed that line, he had tap-danced on it, publicly, for weeks. Those scars, the general continued, his voice now a low, menacing growl as he gestured towards Christina's arms. She earned while carrying 17 American hostages through 40 kilometers of hostile territory. With shrapnel still embedded in her flesh, she did it without rest, without complaint, and without leaving a single soul behind. While you, he fixed Ramos with a look of pure, unadulterated contempt, were in high school, worrying about what kind of car your daddy was going to buy you for graduation. The public humiliation was complete, a perfect, brutal mirror of the humiliation Ramos had inflicted on Christina. He could feel the contemptuous stares of everyone present burning his skin. The soldiers who had once laughed at his jokes now looked at him with open disgust. The veterans shook their heads with expressions of deep, profound revulsion. Colonel Santos, the general addressed Christina, "Why didn't you report this behavior immediately?" "Sir," she replied calmly, "I believed it would be a valuable educational opportunity, both for Private Ramos, and to demonstrate how unconscious biases can compromise the efficiency of a military unit." The response was so brilliant, so strategically sound, that even the general was momentarily taken aback. She had turned 3 weeks of humiliation into a masterclass on leadership and strategic patience. Private Ramos, the general, turned his attention to the devastated young man. You will be immediately transferred to a remote base in Alaska, where you will spend the next 2 years learning about respect and humility. Your family will be notified of the disciplinary reasons for the transfer. This incident will remain permanently in your military file. Alaska, a remote base, a permanent file. Ramos's military career was over before it had even begun. 2 decades of privilege and arrogance, destroyed in 15 minutes of accountability. And one more thing, the general added, his voice carrying a coldness that made Ramos shiver. Colonel Santos could have ended your career on the first day. She could have broken you, physically and mentally, without even breaking a sweat. But she chose to give you time to learn and grow. You wasted that opportunity. As Ramos was escorted out of the hangar under universal, scornful glances, Christina remained motionless, watching his departure with the same serene expression she had maintained throughout the ordeal. There was no malice in her eyes, only the quiet satisfaction of seeing justice take its natural course. Men, the general addressed the remaining soldiers, let this be a permanent lesson. Excellence has no color, gender, or social origin, and underestimating someone based on prejudice is not just ignorance, it's a tactical flaw that can cost lives in actual combat. As the soldiers dispersed, whispering among themselves about the extraordinary events they had just witnessed, one question remained in the air. How had someone who had survived war-defining operations managed to turn personal humiliation into a leadership lesson that would echo through the generations? And would Ramos, now facing the full consequences of his arrogance, finally learn what it truly meant to serve with honor? 6 months later, Fort Davidson Base had become a case study in how a single revelation can completely transform the culture of a military installation. The name Shadow echoed through the hallways, not as a distant legend, but as a daily reminder that excellence can come disguised in the most unexpected forms. Colonel Christina Santos, now officially recognized in her true rank, had been promoted to Deputy Commander of Special Operations for the base. Her office, once a small cubicle in the maintenance wing, now occupied a large room overlooking the training grounds, where young soldiers learned not only combat techniques but fundamental lessons about respect and humility. Arrogance is the most lethal blind spot a soldier can develop, she explained during her mandatory weekly lectures to all recruits. It makes you deaf to the advice of veterans, blind to the skills of those around you, and eventually, dead on the battlefield. Her story had become legend on the base. New soldiers arrived knowing about the officer who had turned 3 weeks of humiliation into a masterclass in strategic patience and calculated justice. The scars on her arms were no longer a source of morbid curiosity, but symbols of valor that inspired genuine respect. Meanwhile, at the Elmendorf-Richardson outpost in Alaska, Private Ramos faced a very different reality. The temperatures reaching -40 were the least of his problems. His reputation had preceded him. Everyone on the base knew exactly why he was there. "You're the kid who mocked the Shadow?" a grizzled master sergeant asked on his first day, his voice carrying a mixture of disbelief and disdain. "Jesus Christ, kid, you really have no idea what you've done, do you?" The 2 years in Alaska stretched out like a frozen eternity. Ramos had lost not only the promising career he had imagined for himself, but also the respect of his colleagues, the trust of his family, and any chance of regaining his military reputation. His father, Colonel Ramos, had stopped taking his calls. After the full details of the incident reached the upper echelons of command, "You have disgraced me, not only as a father but as an officer," were the last words he heard from the colonel. "Until you learn what true military service means, we have nothing more to discuss." Back at Fort Davidson, the transformation was remarkable. Corporal Martinez had been promoted to sergeant and was working directly under Christina, helping to train the next generation of special operators. Sergeant Major Jackson had received a commendation for his meticulous documentation of the case, which became study material at military academies across the country. "Never underestimate someone based on appearances," Jackson would repeat to each new class of recruits, holding up a photo of Christina during her early days as a simple maintenance officer. This woman could have destroyed that boy on his first day, but she chose to teach him a lesson that is worth more than any physical punishment. The story had transcended the walls of the base. Christina received invitations to speak at West Point, the Naval Academy, and prestigious universities. Her book, Silent Leadership: Lessons from the Battlefield for Civilian Life, became required reading in management and organizational psychology courses. "True power does not come from humiliating those who underestimate you," she wrote in the final chapter. It's in turning that underestimation into an opportunity for education and growth, both for yourself and for those who need to learn. During one of General Maxwell's visits, 9 months after the incident, he found Christina reviewing mission reports in her new office. The walls were decorated not with her medals, which remained in storage, but with photos of soldiers she had trained and thank you letters from families she had helped. "Any regrets about how you handled the Ramos situation?" he asked, genuinely curious. Christina reflected for a moment. "No regrets, sir. He got exactly what his actions deserved. But I hope that, eventually, he understands that his experience in Alaska wasn't a punishment, it was an opportunity for rebirth." And she was right. 2 years later, Ramos returned from Alaska a changed man. Not just physically, the cold had toughened his body, but mentally. He had spent 24 months dealing with the consequences of his arrogance, working under officers who would not tolerate disrespect, serving alongside soldiers who knew his story and had no patience for privileged attitudes. When he finally returned to the mainland, he was no longer the arrogant young man who had humiliated a war heroine. He was a man who had learned, in the hardest way possible, that true military value has no color, gender, or social origin. His first act was to write a letter to Christina, a letter she kept on her desk, not as a trophy, but as a reminder that even hearts hardened by privilege can learn to grow. "Colonel Santos," the letter read, "I know I don't deserve your forgiveness, but I need you to know that I now understand what I wasted. Not just the opportunity to learn from one of the best, but the chance to be a better soldier from day one. If I ever have the opportunity to serve again, I will earn the uniform I wear." Christina's response was brief, but meaningful. "Private Ramos, we all deserve second chances. The question is not whether you deserve them, but what you will do with them." Today, Fort Davidson is known not only as an efficient military base, but as an example of how true leadership can transform a toxic culture into an environment of excellence. Young officers from across the country request transfers there, not for the ease, but for the opportunity to learn from someone who proved that true military strength comes from competence, not arrogance. The best revenge, Christina often says, in her lectures, is not to destroy those who hurt you. It is to build something so great, so meaningful, that the injustice you suffered becomes just a stepping stone to something extraordinary.